Ladies and gentlemen, it's now 2 o'clock in Copenhagen, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our webinar. We bring you today Voices from Russia in memory of Per Carlsen. And we have today a webinar dedicated to the memory of Ambassador Per Carlsen, who was also the first director at DIIS. My name is Flemming Splidsboel Hansen. I'll be your host today. And we have a spectacular lineup. We'll be here for about an hour and a half, and I have 3 speakers for you today. First, we have Dmitri, who is the director of Carnegie Center Moscow. We have Andrey, who is with the Russian International Affairs Council. And then finally, but definitely not least, we have Lilia Shevtsova, who represents a Liberal Mission Foundation also in Moscow. As I said, we're here to celebrate the memory of Ambassador Per Carlsen, who was ambassador to Moscow, to Riga, to Vilnius. And Per Carlsen was also the first director at DIIS. And so it seems very fitting that we put together an event like this, research institution / think tank, together with good colleagues from Russia, to give you different perspectives on Russian politics, Russian international affairs, Russian foreign policy, and of course to bring together people who knew Per and who are also close friends with Per. Some of you watching today knew Per, some of you even worked with him. For those of you who didn't know Per Carlsen, let me just say he was very accomplished, very successful diplomat with a fantastic career. And it's my pleasure to be able to put together these 2 webinars. We had our first webinar yesterday, where we invited voices from Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania. And then today we have voices from Russia with the lineup that I just announced. The format is quite simple. We have 3 speakers. I asked each speaker to put together something that they would find interesting. There was only one requirement: to put together a webinar that Per himself would also have liked to attend, and I'm sure that we can accomplish this today. So I very much look forward to this. Each speaker has been given about 20 minutes, and then we'll take a few questions. Dmitri Trenin will go first, and then we'll continue as advertised earlier. The Q&A function is ready for you to use. Please post your questions if you have any, and I'll bring them to our speakers, and I invite you to really use this, and we'll hopefully have a lively and interesting debate. It's a relaxed, comfortable format for everyone. A lot of you out there also know each other already, and here's your opportunity to ask questions, critical questions, to our expert Russian speakers. So with this, let me welcome you again, and Dmitri, let me pass the floor to you, please.
Well, first of all, Flemming, thank you so much for doing this. I've known Per for many years, for several decades actually, before he became ambassador to Moscow, before he even was the first director of the Danish Institute. He always struck me as a very honest man intellectually, someone who was always focused on finding the truth about anything he was looking at, anything that he was researching. And we stayed in touch after his posting to Moscow, after his ambassadorship in Riga. And he paid a lot of attention to what the Carnegie Moscow Center was publishing, and he would often comment on the things that he was receiving, and that was very nice of him. And of course, his comments were very insightful in their own right. I was having a small project with the Danish embassy at the end of last year, and it was focused on the Baltic Sea area security. So I turned to Per for a Danish view of that issue, and he promptly agreed. He said he would do it, and that was at short notice, relatively short notice, because the whole project was put together in a very short period of time. And he came up with a draft. This draft was finished just a day or two before his untimely death. And I was so profoundly shocked by the news of his death. And I was, at the same time, I was struck that the last thing that he did was to do an analysis for the Carnegie Moscow Center, which we subsequently published, which we are proud of. And of course, this is the last, if you like, the last greetings from Per. So I feel privileged. I feel deeply honored by this invitation to be part of this discussion. And you were so liberal in your outlook and in your proposal to us that we could essentially come up with anything that would be worth your while, would be worth the while of your listeners and viewers. And I've been thinking about something that Pierre would be interested in himself. So he was a keen observer of the Russian scene, Russian/Eastern European scene for a number of decades. He saw the progress or lack of progress, or whatever you want to call it, evolution, degradation, improvement, whatever, over the last 30 years. So I thought maybe I will share with you a few pretty random, not well-structured thoughts about the takeaways from Russian foreign policy over the last, let's say, 3 decades, more or less. And I will be, this is not an academic presentation, and I will just give a few thoughts in no particular order, simply as something that would be interesting to discuss, I hope. So my first takeaway from looking at Russia's foreign policy, the lessons learned, if you like, was that the Russian political establishment, if you like, although the word does not really apply fully to the Russian scene, the people who rule Russia essentially have come up to realize that the most important thing in foreign policy was the national interest. There was some discussion of that in the early 1990s, and that discussion, I think, put Russia on the track that it's following even today. So 93, 92 was the point when the discussion of the national interest sort of veered Russia off the path that was leading toward a very different objective, let's say Western integration. And this emphasis on the national interest is different from the occasional reference in Russian foreign policy in the past to the European interest in the 18th century, the 19th century, the imperial interest of the 19th century, the 20th century, the class interest, ideological interest, if you like, that the Soviet Union, of course, was the Soviet foreign policy was marked by, to the universal interest that Mikhail Gorbachev sought to promote. So this is my first takeaway. And the issue is, right now, what is the national interest, what is not the national interest, is defined by, well, like it is in a lot of other countries, it's defined by a very narrow circle of people. And it's they who decide what the nation wants, what the nation should not want. And I think that the task for the future with regard to the national interest is to reconceptualize it as truly national, not something that the elite groups or individuals at the top hold as of prime importance, but something that is good for the bulk of the ordinary Russian people, not the elites, not those circles, vested interests, etc., but the ordinary people. It's interesting that my colleagues in the United States are thinking along similar lines. The Carnegie Endowment in Washington has just come up with a report on a U.S. foreign policy for the middle class. So what foreign policy serves the interests of the middle class in America best? That, I think, is a very interesting way of looking at that. My second takeaway is that Russia has learned that it cannot fit into a bloc or be led by a superior power. And my conclusion from the 1990s and the early 2000s is that Russia's integration into the West founded primarily, I think, although there were many other factors, but primarily on the Russian elite's refusal to buy the entry ticket to the Western community, which is a sincere recognition of American leadership in that community. Everyone who wants to be in buys that ticket. Everyone is happy or otherwise, but they're all there. The Russians essentially rejected that and instead tried to carve out a special position for themselves, which of course ended in failure. And the issue that this raises is how to steer the course in the interconnected, globalized world as a lone power, because that's what Russia is, a lone power, not attached to any outside bloc or any outside power. My third takeaway, and I don't have many, I only have 6, so I will be within, I hope I will be very much within the time limit. Russia found it could not form its own bloc. Not only was it not able to integrate into other people's company, it could not keep the company that it would lead. It stands alone in its neighborhood. Russia's former borderlands of former Soviet republics see their independence as essentially independence from Russia. Many of them wouldn't mind being dependent on others, be that the European Union, the United States, or somebody else. What they abhor and will abhor for the foreseeable future is dependence on Russia. And this is something that the Russian elites need to fully recognize. In conjunction with that, let me add that a major discovery, I think, that Russians are still in the process of making is that Ukrainians and Belarusians are not part of the same community, same Russian people in the 19th century sense of that word, as President Putin believes. And I think that the sooner Russia recognizes that they will be far better off in Moscow if they deal with those countries, Ukraine and Belarus, although they're very different with different orientations, different attitudes to Russia and many other things. As soon as they deal with them as with separate countries, foreign countries, in Ukraine's case, it's unfortunately it's an adversarial country for the foreseeable future, the more effective Russia's policy toward those countries will be. So the issue is now that the former Soviet Union has traveled the path of the Soviet Union, so there's no sense talking about the former USSR as any sort of a unit. How to define the priorities? How to define the priorities in your imperial space? Does it make sense to cling to some places just because they used to be part of the old country or of the empire? And Russia has to redefine itself not as an empire, which is in very much in Russia's past, with all its glory, with everything, but it has to define itself as a great power, but in a new sense, not a power that lords over others, but a power that has the capacity, the capability, the will to be its own master and be resilient to outside pressure, be the master of its own decisions and be resilient to, and be responsible essentially to itself. My next point is that in the nuclear age, most serious threats to national security, even the very existence of the country, lie at home. The Soviet Union collapsed just at the time when the Soviet Union had more tanks than the rest of the world combined, when the Soviet military might was at its peak. And it was on the one hand, at the top, the loss of control by the authorities of the developments at home, and the lack of faith, the loss of faith on behalf of much of the population of the Soviet Union in the authorities' right to rule over them. And this remains as important today as it was 3 decades ago. Because legitimacy in places like Russia, and I would claim in all countries, does not lie in the constitution. I would say it doesn't even lie in the institutions per se, even the institutions of democracy, as we are witnessing in many parts of the world these days, but in the popular support or popular acceptance, at least, of the system of governance. That this system has, and I think we're going beyond the crude by now, I would say it's a crude distinction between authoritarianism and democracy. And it's more about the nature of governance and the quality of governance. And I think the pandemic teaches us that question. So the issue is how to build a system in Russia, a system of governance that would enjoy the support of the bulk of the people, give them a stake in that system, and protect national unity, protect against the kind of internal divisions that can tear countries, even some of the most stable countries, apart. And that is something that I think is very relevant today. If what's happening in the United States right now happened in Russia today, I think Russians would be shooting at one another. And we would be not in a cold civil war, as some claim with reference to the United States, but on a real shooting civil war. So how to make sure that this does not happen? My penultimate point is that the optimal foreign policy posture for a country like Russia, which is big but not big enough, if you like, is to maintain equilibrium as a single independent player, equilibrium between the superpowers, the United States and China. I said that Russia's integration into the West founded on the Russian elites' refusal to be subservient to the United States. But looking into the future, I would say the same thing applies to China. Should China try to impose itself on Russia? So Russia defining itself more as a northern country, it's not a part of the West. It will not be part of the West. It's European, but not Western, if you like. It's not part of the East. It's not Asian. No one in Asia treats Russia as an Asian country. So you are a northern country. We're sitting in one of the coldest capitals in the world. Although global warming is also a reality here. And this equilibrium needs to be maintained between America and China. The confrontation between those two is not Russia's fight. Russia should remember the hard lesson of the First World War, when it got involved in a fight essentially between Germany and England, and lost tremendously as a result. Equilibrium does not mean equidistance. Russia today is much closer to China than it is to the United States, but closeness should not lead to loss of freedom, international freedom, freedom of movement, freedom of maneuver. So Russia will have to learn to deal in using equilibrium as its posture with a lot of issues around the world. And it's a very relevant question in the triangle between China, India, and Russia. And Russia today faces the possibility of its ties with India growing frayed because of its closeness to China. So how to deal with that? How to, or Vietnam for that matter, China, Vietnam, and Russia. Russia is trying that, not without success. Look at how Russia behaved during the Azeri-Armenian war in Nagorno-Karabakh. Russia is managing relations with Iran and Israel at the same time. So there is something to build upon, but I think that should be the most important foreign policy posture. And lastly, pragmatism alone doesn't suffice. Russian foreign policy officials and President Putin himself talked in glowing terms about pragmatism. Fine if you use pragmatism as distinction between the foreign policy of today and the foreign policy of the ideological policy of the Soviet Union. That's fine, but the Soviet Union is 30 years dead. The problem with Russia's policies across the board, and the problem with the Russian elites and Russian society is the paucity of values. The fact that for so many people at the top of the system, there is no values that are not quoted in dollars and euros or rubles, and that's a very big issue. We never had an elite as bad in moral and ethical terms as the current one. And this is a big issue. Without a major sanitation, call it cleansing, call it whatever, I would prefer something much more gentle. But without a turnover of the elites, without the advent of elites who are serving the nation, I don't think Russia will achieve much, either domestically or internationally. And very lastly, I think that there is one principle which I think could help in devising what kind of system of values should replace this money-based pragmatism. It's justice seen as a combination of law and fairness. If you like, it is embodied in the name of a Polish political party, not very popular in Europe, but very popular in Poland, and that's Prawo I Sprawiedliwość. So when we have legality married to legitimacy, when we have justice and fairness on the one hand and the body of laws on the other hand, and there's a balance between the two, then I think we can move forward. So let me stop here. Thank you very much, Dmitri.
Great. Thank you for this wonderful oversight, Dmitri, and for your insightful and to some extent also, I guess, provocative, very direct comments. I noted in particular one of your last comments about the need to change the leadership, which of course is very interesting. And it ties very well into one of the questions that we received already from Terje Baumann. And Terje is a Danish journalist focusing mainly on European affairs. He's one of our leading journalists on this particular matter. And Terje asks about the so-called people's foreign policy. So your first point was also about the national interest and how it's being defined. And Terje Baumann asks about the people's foreign policy and the risk that it may sort of degenerate into a kind of Trumpist foreign policy. If you don't have an elite to deal with this, to sort of temper the foreign policy aspirations of the people, what will you have in the end? Is there a risk of a Trumpist foreign policy?
Well, Trumpism, I think, is an American phenomenon. Elements of that are present in Western Europe. Russia is culturally and politically very different. Russia has a different political culture. I think that in Russia, and this is, I think, the principal distinction between Russia and Europe, if you like. And by Europe, my Europe here would start with Belarus and Ukraine, which I see on the other side of the divide. I think in Russia, the idea of centralized and undivided power is core to the notion of the state. And the notion of the state is essentially equal to, if not above, the notion of a country. And I don't think that this will change very quickly. And this is the internal reason why integration into the West did not go beyond a few baby steps. I think that in the system that is Russia's, and I would expand that to parts of Asia, because I think that Russia has essentially a European culture, but an Asian political culture that was brought by the Mongols and was internalized by the princes of Moscow and then within the Russian Empire, which did not happen actually in Ukraine and Belarus, which was spared for the most part from the Mongol yoke. And this quarter of a millennium of living under the Mongols, with the Mongols, left an indelible mark on the Russian political culture. So I would say that in Russia, the ideal is harmony. It's very much like in China: harmony, consultation, and you amass the interests of various groups. And then, ideally, again, at the top, you decide where you strike the balance. It's not that you give everyone the right to vote, and someone is voted in, someone is voted out, and we have, things that happen in Western societies. I think that in Russian society and in other Asian societies, it comes from a different source. So my answer to that, it would be to go for something that exists in Japan and some other, call them Asian democracies. Asian democracies are very different from, they're different about themselves. Look at South Korea and Japan, but different from European democracies. So yes, you need to keep your ear very close to the ground. You need to understand what people want. And you need to help people understand their interest by being more open, more transparent about what you're doing, globally explaining things, asking them for comment and all that. But essentially, it calls for a system that does not allow, as Lenin would put it, does not allow every cook to run the state, because cooks do not run the state, do not run states very well. If they cook well, that's the most that they can achieve.
Great, thank you for this. Let's take another question. This is from Susanne Loftus, and Susanne is a professor at the Marshall Center in Garmisch-Partenkirchen. And she asked about the economic competitiveness of Russia today, especially as we look at technological revolutions and how to sort of manage new technology and bring it to the use of the state, and of course to bring it also perhaps to the international market. How do you view Russia's competitiveness in terms of its economy overall, and how is its technological status at the moment?
Well, it's competitive in a few narrow areas, as you know. And Russia is doing fine, maybe in a half dozen areas, but not more. Raising competitiveness means raising productivity. Productivity levels in Russia are very low, a quarter of the U.S. level, and it's not growing. Actually, it's slipping. I'm not an economist, so I will not give you an economic recipe. I will acknowledge the fact that you cannot base your claim to being a great power, in my sense, not in the sense of lording over others, but in the sense of being an independent player, unless you have a more advanced economic foundation and technological prowess. The Soviet Union actually had so much more of that than the Russian Federation has today. So the priorities of the government clearly need to emphasize the importance of technology. Russia is trying to do a few things, but having lost so much in the wake of the Soviet demise, and then in the years when essentially people were in the survival mode, and those were very dark years from the standpoint of Russia's technological development. But there's one good thing about confrontation with the United States. The terms of the confrontation are such that you cannot win. You're not think of winning, but you can either lose completely and surrender, or you can use the confrontation as a stimulus. You don't have much competitiveness inside the country for the reasons that we all know. But the United States out there, China in a different direction, because you also have to look at China, are stimulating you to do something about at least providing a modicum of independence in some areas, from technology to finance to the economy, etc. So that competition historically helped Russia, the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union, to come up with successful solutions to some of those technological issues. And the problem here, I think, is the poor quality of the Russian elite. They're not serving the state; rather, they're self-serving guys, self-serving people. They care more about their assets and their homes elsewhere, and use Russia. And that is something that is a huge drag on Russia's evolution.
Thank you for this. This ties very well in with what we could take as our last question. A quick question from Charlotte Flint Pedersen, and Charlotte is the director at the Danish Foreign Policy Society. And I should mention, of course, that in retirement, Per worked out actually as a senior analyst with the Danish Foreign Policy Society. So that's very fitting. And Charlotte asks about the current Russian elite, and she asks you to please compare it to the Soviet nomenclatura.
Well, in some respects, the current elites are way ahead of the nomenclatura. Nomenclatura didn't know much about the world. They were poorly educated, most of them. Again, it's important which part of the history of the Soviet Union we're looking at, because some things that the nomenclatura did, like transporting the entire Soviet industry a few hundred miles or 1,000 or a couple of thousand miles to the east when the Germans invaded, that was a miracle, almost a miracle. I wonder who would be able to do that in today's world. And those were Stalin's commissars, and of course they used the most brutal methods, but there was also some management skills that and total dedication. Now the elites today I think that the problem with Russia, as it is with many other countries, is that the lure of money has canceled out so many much more precious things in the world. And if you're only focused on maximizing your financial gains, wherever you are, you may be a government minister, you may be a local mayor, you may be a policeman on the block or whoever. But if your prime interest is engaging in that kind of activity, then the whole country will be lost. And the people who are the most talented part of society would have a terrible time doing anything productive in that environment. So I hope that, again, international developments, domestic developments, the transition of power that is inevitable at some point in Russia would open up opportunities for a different kind of elite configuration. But it will not be easy. We're talking about people who rule the place and own much of the place, and they have immense power that the old nomenclatura never had. The old nomenclatura only used instruments of force. The elites today are very savvy in using all sorts of methods, and and taking them on is a much more difficult task, as it was to deal with the old nomenclature. The old nomenclature was swept away, at least the top echelon of that nomenclature was swept away fairly easily, I would say, in 1991. But the people who have come to own places, not just to hold a position and maybe have a dacha somewhere, maybe have a decent apartment, but people who own enormous fortunes and who operate on the principle of no holds barred. These people are so much more difficult to take on, but somehow the rotation will need to take place. Otherwise, the country, I think, will degrade even further, and we will have to deal with that problem decades from now, maybe under less propitious circumstances.
Great. Thank you very much for this, Dmitri. I suggest to move on with this and invite Andrey Kortunov to the floor. And Andrey Kortunov, as you will know, of course, is with the Russian International Affairs Council. Andrey, please.
Thank you, Fleming. First of all, I'd like to say that I got acquainted with Per many, many years ago, probably about the same time Dmitri started interacting with him. And I was a frequent visitor to the Danish embassy in Moscow when he was ambassador here, and later on we stayed in touch. I always admired not just his knowledge, not just his political instincts, but also his bold wit and his optimism. He was a very committed person and a person who believed against all the odds that relations between Russia and Europe would get better. The last time I met him was exactly 1 year ago. We had a small workshop in Copenhagen, and we discussed issues of the Baltic region security and cooperation in the Arctic. And as always, he was very active, very enthusiastic, and very perceptive. And we were planning another event. We published a small joint Russian-Danish report last year, and we were considering continuing this cooperation. Now I don't know whether we can do it without his active involvement. I was really very saddened and shocked to learn that he had passed away. It's a major, major loss for all of us, those who knew him and those who worked with him and those who counted on him. So I'm really sorry to hear this news. Now, getting down to the topic of our discussion, I'd like to take a couple of your minutes to follow something that Dmitri has started to discuss already. But let me take a slightly different optics for my presentation, and let me focus not on these big issues, which are of course very important and fundamental to relations between Russia and the West, but let me take smaller, more specific and more situational problems that we have to deal with. And I'd like to suggest the following. Let us roll back time and imagine that we are sitting here not in January of 2021, but rather in January 2020. exactly 1 year ago. I think that if we put ourselves in this environment, we could find reasons to be moderately optimistic about the future of relations between Russia and the West in general, but also Russia and Europe in particular. Let me remind you that in December of 2019, there was a summit meeting of the Normandy group in Paris, which signed a statement. And many believe that this statement, or rather the implementation of this statement by all parties to the conflict, would mean a breakthrough in the situation in East Ukraine, and that we could get much closer to the full implementation of the Minsk agreements, and maybe we could even go beyond the Minsk agreements. So expectations were high. The Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky was quite optimistic, but the Russian side also expressed its optimism and its expectations that finally we started moving somewhere. Now, in January of last year, exactly a year ago, there was a big meeting in Berlin on the conflict in Libya. And before this meeting, there was a smaller meeting in Moscow between the two confronting sides in the Libyan conflict. And later on in Berlin, they reached a couple of very important agreements, both on the ceasefire and on the road to a political reconciliation in this country. And again, there were many optimists who said, okay, finally we started moving somewhere, and if we are successful in Libya, we could probably be successful in other regional conflicts, at least in the Middle East and North Africa region. So there were reasons to be moderately optimistic about some regional conflicts. Later on, the Trump administration announced that it was ready to consider an extension of the New START agreement, and we had a couple of rounds of consultations between Russians and Americans on important strategic issues ranging from strategic stability to space. I think that the meeting on space was held in Vienna in summer, and again, it looked as if there was some real progress on the way to at least maintaining some of the remnants of the old US-Russian or US-Soviet infrastructure of strategic arms control. In spring, Secretary General of the United Nations made an appeal to all sides engaged in regional conflicts to announce a coronavirus ceasefire. And for some time, it seemed that probably the intensity of regional conflicts started to go down. So there were many other indicators that probably the coronavirus would be a turning point, that since we all confront the same challenge, the same problem, that would be a major stimulus for all of us, including Russia and Europe, to start working together and maybe to put some of their disagreements on a back burner. And to tell you the truth, I was also somewhat optimistic about the future. Of course, my optimism was measured, and I didn't entertain the idea of a major reconciliation between Russia and Europe, but at least I hope that things could get somewhat better. Well, now a year later, I think, unfortunately, we have to confess that we were wrong. And things did not get any better. On the contrary, the relations between Russia and the West and Russia in Europe became even more complicated and controversial. Russia was reluctant to start a dialogue with the European Union on events in Belarus. I think they concluded in Moscow that the European Union was practically irrelevant in this particular conflict. Neither they tried to activate the Minsk OSCE group on Nagorno-Karabakh. Russia did interact with France and with the United States, but this interaction was limited primarily to informing other co-chairs about the ceasefire brokered by President Putin. So it was not an attempt to start a real multilateral diplomacy. Of course, the Navalny case has become a major irritant in this relationship. And as you probably know, just a couple of days ago, Navalny got back to Moscow and was detained in the Moscow airport, which of course created an uproar in Europe and in the West at large. So to cut it short, the opportunity, if this opportunity existed over last year, was not used. And I don't want to say that there is only one side to blame for the inability to make full use of this opportunity. But I will not talk about the Western side. I think that you probably know better what omissions or mistakes were made on the Western side. Let me just limit myself to the Russian side. Why? Why this window of opportunity was not used to fix the relationship, or at least to manage this adversarial relationship better than we actually did? I think that there are a couple of explanations, and you can choose any of them to your liking. First of all, you can argue that when the pandemic hit the West, there were expectations in Moscow that Russia would probably manage the pandemic better than the West. And indeed, if you look at the first wave, I think it is fair to say that Russia was not affected as much as most of European countries. So probably the expectation was that we will come out of this pandemic stronger than our adversaries, and therefore we would be in a better position to start negotiations with them. And I do recall a statement of one of the assistants to President Putin, who said that by the end of 2020, Russia will become number 5 in the global economy, not because Russia will be stronger, but because other countries, Germany in particular, will have a steeper decline in their economic output than Russia. So arguably the expectation was that Russia can demonstrate better results, that Russia is closer to China in how it handles the coronavirus, and therefore we are not in a hurry to start resuming the dialogue with our European neighbors. I think that this expectation proved wrong, that Russia was hit as hard as its neighbors, and basically the pandemic itself, the way how it proliferated in Russia, demonstrates that at least socially Russia is much closer to European nations than it is to Asian countries. Indeed, there are common patterns. I think we can make generalizations about Russia, about Europe, and definitely that proves, I don't want to contradict Dmitri in terms of his assessment of the Russian political culture, but I think that the way how Russia met the pandemics proves once again that the Russian society is predominantly European rather than Asian. Another explanation that I can offer you is that Russia was not in a position to use the window of opportunity because of the huge inertia of the state machinery. For years and years, at least since 2014, and maybe even since earlier days, the Russian state machinery was focused on the confrontation, and that includes most of bureaucracies, that includes state propaganda, that includes to a large extent the Russian intellectual community. And even if you have political will and intention to change that, it is not easy. It is not easy because the inertia is huge, and the inertia turns you into a hostage to the predominant political trends that existed before. So probably that was one of the explanations why we still have the information warfare between Russia and the West, why our state propaganda remains so anti-Western, and why any steps to improve the relationship with Western partners are so modest. Another explanation is that probably they thought in Moscow that the Russian goodwill would be interpreted as a sign of weakness, that any gesture would be considered as an invitation to increase political pressure on Russia. And I think it's typical for the Russian political thinking to avoid unilateral steps or any symbolic concessions, because there is a fear that it will be abused by the other side, and that in the end of the day, it will lead to more pressure and more concessions. And I think that explains why Russia was not ready to demonstrate a little bit more flexibility in the strategic field, to demonstrate more moderation in terms of military exercises, or more transparency in its military posture. And finally, I think the last explanation that I can give is that basically in the Kremlin, they looked around and they saw no interlocutor. The Trump administration was coming to its end, so it would be probably careless to invest too much into political dialogue with the Trump administration, given the political uncertainties of the situation in the United States. And in Europe, of course, the European Union was preoccupied with things other than Russia. For instance, Brexit was still an important business to handle. And of course, the European Union had issues with countries like Poland and Hungary. And on top of that, the political cycle in Germany was already coming to its end. It was already clear that Chancellor Merkel will step down in 2029. And the political situation in Germany remained very unclear. So basically, arguably, they could have decided that it's better to wait. It's better to wait and not to come up with any strategic plans or large-scale proposals or some great ideas that should inspire Europe and the United States. So now we are in the beginning of a new political cycle. We have the Biden administration in the United States, and we will have elections in Germany this year. So I can foresee changes. Unfortunately, most of these changes are not likely to have a positive impact on relations between Russia and the West. It does not mean that we should sit on our hands doing nothing. I think that there are still some opportunities, probably not huge opportunities, but very practical opportunities and I can give you a very short, not to take too much of your time, I will give you a very short laundry list on what we should focus on, in my view. I think that the good news is that Russia seems to be ready to take the European Green Deal seriously, and to some extent even to become a part of this Green Deal. So I think that in terms of climate change, environment protection, biodiversity, there are significant opportunities for working together. I guess that with the European Union, another area of potential cooperation is 5G and digital technologies in general. It's a sensitive issue. I understand that there are limitations on what can be done, and there are concerns about the Russian interference. But nevertheless, I think digital economy and the new generation of communications is an important area where Russia and the European Union can work together. I think that there are certain opportunities in relations between the European Union and the Eurasian Economic Union. Again, I don't think that it will be a game changer. I think that opportunities are limited, but nevertheless, I would definitely welcome more technical interaction between the two institutions and more experience sharing between them. I think it might diffuse some of the problems that exist between Russia specifically and EU member states by elevating this relationship to the institutional level. I think that there are certain limited, but nevertheless not insignificant opportunities in out of area issues. And I would like to emphasize specifically EU-Russia cooperation, potential cooperation on securing JCPOA, the multilateral deal on the Iranian nuclear program. I think that there might be some openings, limited, but still some openings on the Middle East peace process. If the Biden administration decides to go multilateral, maybe it will take a more balanced approach to Israel and to Palestine. Again, that might give some new ideas and new options for Russia and Europe working together. And finally, let me say that I personally believe that we can explore in more details the European idea of new connectivity, linking the European Union, Central Asia, China, and Russia. At least in terms of transportation infrastructure, communications, I think there is something here that can be explored in more detail. And finally, let me wrap up my brief presentation with one observation. I think that when we are talking about the future of relations between Russia and Europe, the nature of this relationship, the scale of this relationship, the format of this relationship depends primarily on whether Russia embarks on the way of serious structural reforms of its economy. Europe will matter much more if the Russian leadership at some point decides that it should get out of its current rent-seeking economic model and to unleash the potential of the Russian human capital, to incentivize innovation, to support a small and medium-sized business, because if this decision is made, Europe becomes indispensable. It can offer something that neither East Asia nor North America can offer Russia. And that would lead to two major communities of stakeholders emerging in Russia that would have vested interests in better relations between Russia and Europe. Until it happens, I don't think that we will have any significant groups in the Russian leadership really committed to better relations between Russia and Europe. And unfortunately, I think that until Russia changes its current economic mode of operations, it would be very difficult to see a real breakthrough in relations between Moscow and Brussels. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrey, and thank you for what I hear as a mainly optimistic scenario. And I suspect, I hope, if we meet in January 2022, we'll see how much this has actually happened. That would be very interesting, of course. I also note your final remark concerning the Russian elite and perhaps a different view, at least when it comes to the economy, as a precondition for improvements. And let me just, if you will allow me, ask a question concerning that. When we do have major crises, as we do today, often it invites new thinking. Sometimes it even forces new thinking to take place. Do you see this as an accelerator of new thinking inside Russia? For instance, when it comes to relations between Russia and the West, between Russia and other actors in the international system?
Well, you know, my take is that if you look at the Russian intellectual community, it is deeply divided and polarized in its attitudes towards the West and towards potential for broader cooperation between Russia and its Western neighbors. On the one hand, we do have some die-hard liberals in our country who still believe that the Russian destiny is primarily in Europe. It does not exclude Russia trying to reach out to Asia. China is and will become important no matter what happens. But I think that liberals still believe that the Russian destiny, the Russian fate is in the West rather than in the East. On the other hand, of course, if we look at what happens today, especially, you know, the pandemic, I think the pandemic was a major incentive for Russian thinkers and maybe for Russian politicians to focus on the East even more than they did before. Because the perception was that, look, we used to consider the United States as a symbol of modernity, as a country which is a model country, which gives an example of how you should plan your economy or how you should deal with problems when problems emerge. However, the pandemic demonstrated that the United States is no longer a symbol of modernity, and that it is clearly inferior to China and to some other Asian countries. I think on the basis of this logic, the conclusion is made that liberal democracy in general has depleted its functionality, that we should look for political examples and models in the East rather than in the West. So I would venture to say that the pandemic has accelerated this shift in the Russian intellectual community from the West to the East. However, of course, if we talk about the younger generation of Russians, they have, in my opinion, a very different mental framework. And for them, it no longer matters the East or the West. What matters is whether Russia remains isolated from the rest of the world or becomes integrated into the rest of the world. So the question is not about the geographical priorities. The question is about the strategy of development. And of course, if you talk to younger people, if you interact with students, there are very many of them who would definitely prefer a more integrationist strategy, even if this integration is accompanied by political and economic risks.
Thank you for this. Let's take a couple of questions more. We have a question from Charlotte Bro, and Charlotte is one of my colleagues at DIIS. She's a senior analyst, and she asked specifically about the corona pandemic. And she asked you to please reflect on what this has done, the handling by the Russian authorities of this pandemic has done to the legitimacy of the Russian political system.
Well, of course, the Russian leadership continues to argue that it's a success story, that in relative terms we did better than many other countries, especially many other countries in the West. And I think I wouldn't say that these statements are absolutely groundless. If you look at the mortality rate, for example, you'll see that Russia has been doing relatively well compared to most of major European nations like the United Kingdom, for example, or Italy or France, not to mention the United States. The per capita mortality rates in Russia have been relatively low. The Russian leadership also takes pride in the fact that Russia was the first country to register an anti-coronavirus vaccine. And again, there are many speculations about these vaccines. In general, there was a vaccine race that still is in the world. I'm not in a position to compare the Russian vaccine to Western vaccines, but definitely this is considered to be a major accomplishment, though the leadership itself had to confess that there are problems with the mass production of this new medicine, that we could have invented something great, but it does not necessarily imply that we will be first to go through the mass vaccination. So in terms of the leadership, I think many in Russia concluded that the pandemic was the first case when the top leadership turned out to be ready to delegate a lot of powers to regions. Basically, Putin spent most of this time in his bunker, and his strategy was to give governors a lot of authority, a lot of decision-making power in terms of how they should approach the situation in their respective regions and how they should deal with the pandemic. If you look at the approval ratings of Mr. Putin, I think generally they go down, but not in a very radical way. So it's not clear what happened to the so-called Putin's majority. Many sociologists now would argue that the Crimea consensus is history, and that basically state has to look for other sources, some other sources of legitimacy, which it fails to provide. But I don't want to go into details because I hope that this is an issue which will be covered much more professionally by Lilia Shevtsova, who is one of our top experts on the political developments inside Russia.
Great, thank you for this, and Lilia will, of course, have the word in a few minutes. If you will allow me, Andrey, just a final question for you. It's from Ambassador Uffe Balslev. And Uffe asks about the current position of Russia. Now, you talked about some of the challenges that Russia has also been facing this year and perhaps did not quite, last year, 2020, and perhaps did not quite achieve what was expected by the beginning of the year, especially when the pandemic hit. Do you see a possibility that Russia will try to compensate in a way by being more active in multilateral settings? So to seek influence through multilateral settings in a way that perhaps a more confident Russia would not have done?
Well, let me say that first of all, I'm an enthusiastic multilateralist. Therefore, I always look for some indicators that Russia goes multilateral, and sometimes I get it wrong. But I can tell you that I interact with a number of governmental agencies, especially if you take the economic bloc of the government. There is a lot of interest to multilateralism, and there is an understanding that we do not use multilateral fora the way we should, that Russia still has to master its art of multilateralism, and that basically this goal should be put as a priority. So I'm not sure that the same can be said about multilateralism in the security field. I don't know, and I would be surprised to find out that it's the case. But if you take development, if you take climate, if you take resource management, I think there is an interest in multilateralism. And I would agree that probably this interest is a kind of virtue of necessity, in the sense that Russia turned out to be vulnerable to many problems which it cannot resolve on its own. So some kind of international cooperation is indispensable. I hope that we will see manifestations of this trend in many international fora this year. Russia, as we all know, is a member to G20, to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, to BRICS, to APEC, to many other multilateral settings. And I can tell you that we use our very limited capabilities to push the Russian foreign policy in this direction, because that seems to be the logical way to go for. A lot will also depend on whether Russia is allowed to make use of multilateralism. It will partially depend on the attitudes by the Biden administration. And I think that Biden stands for value-based multilateralism, which will clearly create certain limitations for many countries to join US-led multilateral structures. But I think that we can still hope that in some areas multilateralism will be an option, and probably we'll see a more multilateralist Russia in years to come than we see today.
Thank you for this. Thank you for seeing us off on a somewhat hopeful note. Let's see, and let's hope that this will also happen, that we see a world of more cooperation. We'll now turn to our third and final speaker, Lilia Shevtsova. But before I invite Lilia to the screen, let me just thank Dmitri Trenin and Andrey Kortunov for your participation today. I understand you need to go to a meeting. It's actually the same meeting that you have to attend. And it's wonderful, of course, when we meet like this, you can manage everything from home in a way. So thank you very much for taking time today to speak to us, to bring us these words of wisdom, and of course also for supporting the work of DIIS. So thank you very much, and hope to see you back soon. With this, I turn to Lilia Schatzel, who is with the Liberal Mission Foundation, and as Andrey already said, leading Russian expert on Russian society, what goes on inside the country. So with this, Lilia, please, let's hear from you.
Okay. thank you, Fleming, and before my friends leave this screen, I want to say that it's a great fun that we three here represent a very broad community of Per's friends. And this community in Russia, I would say, well, include dozens of people, because Per was lovable and liked not only by us, by people who are having the same take, but he was loved and liked even by his opponents for his sincerity, for his intellectual honesty, and for his absolutely wonderful, wonderful friendliness. And for me, Per had two qualities that are so rare in a person. His feeling of empathy for nations, for people, for us, and his absolutely wonderful sense of humor, acerbic sense of humor many times, and very friendly sense of humor when he was talking to his friends. But I will be, if I may, I will be talking about Per's legacy. We are talking about Per as a person, as a friend, as a wonderful colleague, as a shrewd political analyst, as one of the most successful, I would say, ambassadors from the Russian point of view. But he is leaving us a legacy that we should cherish, remember, and formulate. One part of this legacy, as I would say, is his absolutely amazing ability to network. And once I said to Per, you're kind of center of the gravity, center of every gang when we are gathering at the conferences. And he mentioned, you can put it as the master art of networking. Yes, he was networking because he had a mission. He was creating channels of friendship. He was creating channels for dialogue. And thanks to Per, we had this wonderful channel of dialogue between Russian experts, and at least two, the biggest, the largest, the most sophisticated experts are here, and Danish expert community. And thanks to Per, his friends were becoming our friends. I'm talking apparently, first of all, about Charlotte Pedersen and our friends from the Danish Foreign Policy Society, and from your institute, from the Institute of International Studies. And we are talking about these absolutely wonderful meetings and lunches and dinners with Per's biggest friend, Uffe, Minister Ellemann Jensen. Sometimes I was asking Per, what do you think about that and that? Maybe I will have your citation. He said, well, my citation quote, you can quote me as, and he said several phrases. And then he said, oh, listen, let's call Uffe, he will do better. And I have so many citations of Minister Jensen in my book. Well, I hope for more. And there is one more part of Per's legacy that I want to mention, and he would agree with me. I'm not sure that he would like more praises because, well, just imagining Per, what he's thinking about us from above, I would say that he's making a joke, he's cracking a joke. But he would agree when I would offer for you Per's method, because he has signature on this method. I asked him whether I can quote him a couple of months ago. And Per's approach, or Per's method is the following. So I will formulate it as he formulated it. In order to think big, this is Per's words, in order to think big and new, we need to do some reassessment. We need to trace our steps back. We need to reassess the axioms and beliefs that have become outdated or naive. This is his invention. This is his approach. And we've been trying to use Per's approach during our numerous conversations when we were meeting each other in Copenhagen and Moscow the last time, and through this invention, the media, the social networks, the email. And we discussed a lot this the situation of extension, of exhaustion, intellectual, academic exhaustion, exhaustion of the old paradigms, exhaustion of the axioms that we believed for many years. And this conversation of exhaustion, of misperceptions pushed us back. And we started to discuss 10 years past, 10 years. We discussed the 90s, even the 80s. And once, it was during this summer, he said to me, listen, you are so critical. Well, sometimes you are cruel, but not to yourself. What about your own confession, he said. And I wrote him, what kind of confession, Per? He said, confession of your own fallacies. Can you be courageous enough to tell me when you were wrong? And when you admit that you were wrong, what are your misperceptions? Do you have any? Or you feel that you're a saint? This is Per's acerbic sense of humor. And I thought a minute, and I wrote him back, Per, my first confession to you is, I was wrong, pathetically wrong. And I feel that, you know, I was so stupid. I was wrong about Gorbachev and Yeltsin. And after that, I was a bit angry with myself because, well, he pushed the right button. He pushed the button that forced me to think, well, about my own inadequacy. And I started to make a list of my own fallacies, well, about Russia and the West, about, you know, my perception of Russian leadership, of Russian system, of Russian population. And it was a long list. I nearly finished it last month, but Per is gone. And I'm not sure that I want to discuss this list with anyone else, but maybe I could. So I will use Per's method. Let's retrace our steps. Let's look back and put down on the table, just like Andrey Kortunov ordered me, several axioms or several beliefs, at least my beliefs, that need some refreshment or need to be dusted. There are a lot of things about Russia that we Russia hands have been inventing, have been cherishing, promoting, that need some kind of reassessment. Well, and we need to get rid of our self-deception. So this issue, number one, the role of Gorbachev and Yeltsin. And I have to admit that, well, even in the early 90s, I was thinking good riddance about Gorbachev. Just like many other Russian liberals and Democrats, we thought that Gorbachev was a hindrance, was obstacle, that he has to be dusted, brushed away from the political scene, and Yeltsin is our leader, and Yeltsin is the real architect, you know, of Russian liberal democracy. Not anymore. And today, apparently there will be next month, there will be a lot of discussion of Gorbachev. Why? Because Gorby is approaching his 90th birthday on March 2nd. And there will be probably debates on his role, on what he did in those years, whether he did it correctly or not, whether he was wrong or right. And I just want to, I want to argue now that for me today, Gorbachev, isolated, marginalized in Moscow, nearly forgotten by Russia, he deserves respect, credit for the fact that he changed the world. He changed not only the correlation of forces, the balance of powers, he erased the alternative to liberal democracy, but he ended the Cold War, but he was the only one, the first leader in Russia's history, Russian and Soviet history, who tried to open this system, to open this country, to give it some breath of air. He failed, but he failed not only because he was pathetic, but because we were pathetic. And looking back from the time distance, you know, looking at Yeltsin, now we see that it was Yeltsin, it wasn't Putin. It was Boris Yeltsin who became the architect of the new system of personalized power in Russia, who is responsible, guilty of the fact that we went this way, we went this trajectory, and we closed the windows. So he is the godfather of our current reality. And both personalities, both Gorbachev and Yeltsin, of course, they are tragic personalities. Yeltsin is tragic personality too, because he understood what he had done, but it was too late. Second issue that I would put on the table, this is the issue of Russian liberals. Well, the role of Russian liberals in what is happening to us. Russian liberals, we call them now systemic liberals. They were the people, powerful, formidable, successful in their mission, still playing on the political scene, still participating in the functioning of the system. Well, they believe that we, Russia, we need fixers, but not fixed principles. They dreamed about the Russian Pinochet, and they found him. And even now they're trying somehow to increase the one-man power in order, maybe hoping that one-man power will drag Russia from the abyss, economic abyss that we are now. And one may even argue that Russian liberals have much more responsibility for Russian decay, for Russian degradation than the representatives of the power ministries. Third topic that apparently needs revelation. I didn't have time to discuss it with Per in a context, but apparently he would look in above, apparently he will agree with me. This is the role of the Russian foreign policy. And my friends here, Dmitri and Andrey, already started to discuss the paradigm of Russia's foreign policy and what Russian foreign policy is doing to Russia. Well, I would probably emphasize a bit different angle. The role of Russia's foreign policy as the factor in pursuing Russia's domestic agenda. Well, it's Russian foreign policy that is a powerful instrument in preserving the current situation, in preserving current Russia's status quo, in pursuing the goals, the targets, the agenda of Russia's personalized power. And Russia's foreign policy has been pretty successful for a long time to beef up Putin's political leadership and the current political ruling class that both Dmitri and Andrey were so critical of. But what are the results? Now Russia's foreign policy in its current context, with its current toolkit, became not only obsolete, but became a burden for the same Russia's personalized system. Firstly, Russia's geopolitical gambits created a hostile environment around Russia. Secondly, well, they undermined even Russian galaxy. What are the friends of Russia in the post-Soviet space, where China and even Turkey have started to play? And what is even more important, Russia's foreign policy brought limitation or exhaustion even of the very important instruments for the Russian economy, technology and investment. And I wonder, and we all are wondering here in Russia in our Zoom debates, we are talking about shrinking resources of the Russian system, economic resources, ideological resources, propaganda resources, resources of the Russian political elite to control the situation. And in this context of shrinking domestic resources, the question, dramatic question, Shakespearean question, could be raised. In this context, what could be Russia's foreign policy? How the Kremlin would use Russian foreign policy agenda and great power status or ambition to be great power country to support the decaying system. And the question is hanging in the air. And maybe the last in my long list, but I don't have time to expand on it, the last point that I would raise, Putinalia. I call it Putinalia, or obsession with Putin. Anything you read in the foreign media, in the foreign books, anything you read in Russian social media, you'll find 90% of articles, essays, deliberations are related to Putin. Yes, well, I would agree Putin is the symbol of the country, the symbol of the state, personalization of the system. Putin is in control, definitely, still is, apparently, although there is such a notion that I am playing with impotent omnipotence. At what time, at what moment omnipotence is becoming impotent? We have to deliberate on that. But with Putin's, let's imagine Putin is gone. The construct that he has been created together with liberals, conformists, intellectuals, different segments of the society will remain on the political scene. The construct will remain as the Russian political system, and how to get rid of that. And there are two issues apparently that I would like to mention, issues that are that do not belong to the past, that are contemporary. One of the issues raised by Andrey Kortunov, he raised the issue of Navalny. Navalny as the challenge, as the test. Yes, we have Navalny test. Navalny test for the Russian system, Navalny test for the behavior of the Western powers, Navalny test for the Russian society. Navalny and detention of Navalny and, well, the attempt to kill him, of course, and the arrest and detention him just recently is the test for the Russian system, for the Kremlin, and for the President Putin to allow any sign of opposition, of dissent. No opposition, no dissent. So in some sense, we are living in a new country, starting with January 2021. This is a new chapter, folks, new chapter. The second test for the society, whether society will agree with that, whether the society, liberal minority, or even passive majority, around 60% of population will be happy with that. This is still a test, a question, and a question that could be answered pretty soon. And more existential question that we discussed with Per, and Per was a bit critical of it because he said to me, you're raising such strategic questions that cannot be responded now. But I'm sick with this, I'm obsessed and sick with this question. And not only myself, but a lot of people, of my friends here. And the question like 666 is constantly on the wall for us. We already come into conclusion, and what my friends, colleagues have mentioned just during this hour, we already come into conclusion that Russia is a rather unique civilization, genetically unique, due history, tradition, etc., political class, even society, and be in a unique position with such history, with such tradition, and with this post-communist legacy that made us absolutely pathetic and maybe not ready for any kind of serious change. Could this system be transformed at all? Or if the system is not transformed, if it's hanging between the West and China, then it's not transformed. It's a lonely state, or Titanic looking for its iceberg. Then should we wait for the system to go down in flames and collapse, and then we have to start from the screw? Hardly the Russian population will like this idea. Hardly you folks and the West and Europeans and Baltic friends would like this idea too. Anyway, I am finishing here. You're too exhausted apparently with our deliberation. But I would like just to mention again, returning to Per. It will be constructive, useful, and Per would like it if you continue this dialogue with our Danish friends, and if Fleming will convene other meetings when we will be less emotional, but thinking about Per, one has to be emotional, and Per's method and Per's approach would help us, well, at least to move to the truth. Fleming, I am done. Thank you.
Thank you, Lilia, for this very personal, touching, and of course, as always, very insightful observation. Let me start where you started. Take a look at Gorbachev and Yeltsin, and it's a very interesting place to start, of course. And when we look back, and when we think back at the changes that did happen, they were very abrupt. How do you see the Russian political system today, Russian society, when you compare to what happened then? Will changes in Russia have to be abrupt? Now, you mentioned at the end the possible transformation, but what kind of changes do you see in the future? gradual changes or again turning a corner rather sort of abruptly and quickly?
It's similar. It's a bit Hamlet question, to be or not to be. There are two divides, or I would say two groups. Let it make it simpler. Two groups, at least with our community, including liberals, realists, pragmatists, etc. One group believes that some model of transformation that took place in the world through elite splitting and part of the elite, together with some dissent in the population, will create a coalition, just like it happened in some countries of Eastern Europe, in some Baltic states, and in Southern Europe. And they gradually, this combination, this consensus, this coalition will take Russia to the rule of law state gradually, without outburst, without people to take into the street. So there are people who believe in this possibility, and they are working even on the models, on the models of the Russian rule of law state. The only weak point, they cannot explain us how we'll move during the very important transition period between the point of departure and the future rule of law, because there is a kind of gray zone. Another part of experts, and even experts who do not belong to the liberal camp, they started to believe recently that apparently this peaceful transformation cannot be achieved. Why? Because the system itself is shooting in its feet, and the system itself trying to survive. This is the law of unintended consequences. So the system trying to survive by closing all channels of articulation, by making Russia a Sahara Desert, pushes the people to the street, and making the street violence, street turmoil, and revolution the Russian tradition and the only exit. So we are divided. And so far, we don't know which scenario is more feasible. But one thing is definitely, and again, this is per method, returning to the East European transformation, to the Baltic transformation. Regrettably, I have to say that Russia, and maybe even Ukraine and Belarus now at this point, will not use that Eastern European model. Why? Because the exit from communism was much easier. The exit from post-communism is much more complicated. First of all, because liberalism is such a discredited idea, discredited inside and outside. Look at Trump in America. And because of the merger between private property and power, the emergence of oligarchy, everything distorts the model, and we don't know how to get out of that. And Ukrainian experience is very important. Yes, of course, Russia is different. Russia is has this great power status and other ambitions, but Ukraine shows that one can achieve electoral democracy. Ukraine is electoral democracy, but how difficult from the oligarchic rule to come to the rule of law state. So this will be a problem. So you see, very postmodernist response to a question.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions, but I would just like to give myself the liberty of just following up quickly with what you mentioned about Navalny and this new chapter, which I think is really interesting. And I made a note of it, but that we are seeing the beginning now of a new chapter. Which type of legitimacy is this chapter built on? So you mentioned 60% of Russians accept this now, but what is the legitimacy that it draws on, and how long can it be sustained?
You mean legitimacy? You mean legitimacy of the system, of the leadership, yes?
Well, to the extent that people will support this new chapter, that they accept that these are the state of affairs in Russia today.
I would, Fleming, thank you for the question. Well, as if you are sitting in our kitchens and listening to us, I will apply my response on the poll data and my understanding of the polls. Well, 60% of the respondents still approve Putin's activity. Well, Yes, it's not 80% anymore, and the Crimea consensus that supported Putin in 2014-15 is gone. But at the same time, well, approximately 55-60% of people believe that their living standards are falling down. They are unsatisfied with their life, with their salaries, with their perspectives, with their hope that is vanishing and becomes delayed disappointment. So you start to compare how could you support the president, understanding that the president is not only symbol, that this is the rule, well, the main, the key, the only ruler, and at the same time you are unsatisfied. Either you are double thinking, just like under the Soviet time, or you've got cognitive dissonance and you need a kind of lobotomy. And at the same time, you have this spots of unsatisfaction, of frustration, of disappointment along in the regions. Just look, people in Khabarovsk, the Far East, every week they go to the street demanding dignity. This is not, demand for overthrow of Putin. No, not yet. But this is the sign of dissatisfaction. So overall, the fact that legitimacy of power is vanishing or is shrinking is being understood and acknowledged by the Kremlin itself. Why? The sign is the constitutional amendments that make, the rule of the Kremlin and of the presidency omnipotent and forever. It says about worry, concern, and a lack of self-assuredness. And the fact that the government have started the repressive tools also says that there are so few sources for legitimacy. And moreover, and I'm finishing here, there is a huge Russia question now on the agenda. The authorities do understand it, the society does understand it, and we would like the Western experts to understand it. At least the Kremlin and Putin do understand it, and they don't know what to do with that. This is the conflict between the one-man rule that has to be legitimized by something. There is no idea, there is no communism, there is no monarchy. It has to have some source of legitimacy, and the only legitimacy is elections. But elections need to have some uncertainty of the result. So there is a conflict between the wish, the demand of power to be certain, and the elections that, if they have to be elections, are always uncertain. And they don't know how to solve this conflict. And this conflict could, in the end, could force the burst open and flames in the end at some point.
Thank you. Let's take two questions from some of our participants. We have a question again from Charlotte Flint-Pedersen, whom you know and you mentioned, of course, from the Danish Foreign Policy Society. And Charlotte goes back to some of the things that were mentioned by Andrey concerning structural reforms in Russia. And Charlotte asks who people in the West should cooperate with in Russia as it stands right now, while we wait for structural reforms. Who are the people to approach and to cooperate with? And is there a risk that these people will be seen as foreign agents? So a bit of advice, a piece of advice on how to proceed in our relations with Russia.
Well, unfortunately, I can't give any advice. Why? Because, well, the question already has the answer. Well, any kind of support from the West, any West, even from more or less benevolent for the Russian political class, Germany, any kind of support for any force that is not part of the system, that is not part of the ruling class, will be viewed as destructive, as interference, and the recipients of that force and assistance, even analytical, intellectual assistance, will be marked as foreign agents. And not many people would like to have this kind of, a nomination foreign agent on their foreheads. But there is another kind of assistance that could be indirect, and that's the only indirect assistance that we, those who are looking forward optimistically into our future, maybe we are wrong about our optimism, is, make your own house in order. For us, it will be a great advantage that United States of America will cope with its own problems. For us, it will be a great dividend, benefit, support, and assistance if not only Eastern European countries, Baltic countries, but Europe will be much more attractive in pursuing the liberal democratic model. Well, and especially in answering one question that our population is, racking its brains on, the question of justice and equality, which in fact does not fit my former previous old type of liberalism, this dogmatic liberalism, but it means that we are waiting for liberal democracy to include some left qualities into the ideology and structure that will appeal to our moods and to our demands in Russia. So it's not an advice, it's simply anticipation and expectation.
Thank you. Let's take our final question. This is from Christian Fischer, the director at DIIS, and it takes us full circle because Christian asks about something relates also to what Dmitri spoke about at the beginning, Russian foreign policy. And Christian is curious about whether Russia's policy towards some of the smaller states, specifically Ukraine, Belarus, has prompted some kind of rethinking inside the Russian elite about how to approach these smaller states in general, post-Soviet smaller states in particular, perhaps. Do you see any changes here?
Well, I don't see any changes in the official Russian doctrine. I don't see any changes in the face of Sergei Lavrov and foreign ministry speakers. I don't see even changes in foreign policy rhetoric of President Putin. But I do feel, sometimes you smell something in the air, but I do feel some tentative changes in the debates and discussion of foreign policy issues, well, not among liberals, but among, I would say, Russian rallies, because, well, Russian foreign policy community is rather conservative, and majority of Russian foreign experts are rather pragmatic orientation. So they're not speaking anymore of New Yalta, okay? And apparently they have sober understanding that it's so difficult for Russia with the shrinking resources and with, I would say, unwillingness for next confrontation with the West, despite of all this rhetoric, macho bullying rhetoric. Well, Putin is not ready for the new harsh confrontation. So they do understand that it's very difficult for Russia to keep the galaxy on board, to control all the states where China is playing without any kind of restriction. And with Turkey now penetrating the South Caucasus and Russia having nothing to do to stop it. And with Ukraine definitely already saying goodbye to Mother Russia. Well, we'll never have Ukraine back as an ally. And Belarus, if Russia continues to support Lukashenko, Belarusian population definitely will change its positive view of the Russian state and longing to be together with Russia. So there is understanding of the fact that the former areas, the concept of areas of influence is not working. But there is nothing to substitute, with exception of probably one idea. And President Putin already started perhaps to move in that direction. So Russia wants the West, the Western civilization, and the United States of America, well, to recognize Russia's right to interpret the rules of the game and the international principles, okay? And if Russia will be moving in this direction, it will be some vague concept of new Russia's great power force, with exception of nuclear armaments. Well, but that means also that in this context, Russia is not going to obey the rules of the rules-based international order. So there is another threat. This kind of configuration of new hope, of new concept, does not mean that if the Russian system and the Russian rulers suddenly become dysfunctional, lose control over the situation, they will not repeat the Ukrainian gambit in Belarus, for instance. It doesn't mean anything at all. And maybe President Putin leaving the scene like King Lear when finally say, you know, my legacy should be the new union of friendly states. Well, nothing is excluded, because the country that lost its trajectory, the country in decay, the country that tries to survive by, you know, by turning to control and stability, well, at some point could become reckless.
Thank you again, Lilia. Thank you for wrapping up everything and tying everything up so neatly and elegantly as ever. We've come to the end of our webinar. Let me remind you that we held a webinar to celebrate the memory of Ambassador Per Carlsen, who sadly passed away in December. And I think it was very much done in the spirit of Per, which of course is very satisfying. And we were joined by Lilia Shevtsova here at the end from Liberal Mission Foundation in Moscow, and earlier also in the webinar by Dmitri Trenin, who is at the Carnegie Center in Moscow, and by Andrey, who is with the Russian International Affairs Council. Let me thank you for joining us today. Let me also encourage you to go to the DIIS website, where you will find more information on upcoming events and publications. And even if you go to the very end of the DIIS website, at the very bottom, you can click to receive our newsletter, and it will give you automatic updates on events and publications. With this, I thank you again. I hope to see you back soon, and I hope everyone will stay safe and healthy, and I hope everyone will have a nice evening. See you back here again at DIIS very soon. Thank you.
Thank you.